Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Platform and Easter House for our celebration of public transport policy. This is Bus Regulation, the musical. Hold on to your seats. Over the next 30 minutes, you'll be taken on a whistle-stop tour of more than 60 years of history. We'll see how key political decisions have affected the quality of our public transport and how the quality of our public transport ultimately affects the quality of all our lives. Please welcome your host for this afternoon, Nellie the Clippy.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming along the day. I'm Nellie the Clippy. I worked as a bus conductress for Glasgow Corporation Transport in the 1950s and 60s, and you'll no believe the change I lived through in that time. We used to have a world-class tram network, covering all corners of the city and reaching out as far as Paisley, Clydebank, Mulgai, Coatbridge and Cambuslang. We used to have train lines linking up the Botanics, Maryhill and Possil, and train stations at Buchanan Street and St Enoch where you could easily hop on the subway or on a bus. But a few bright sparks, Richard Beechin at the British Transport Commission and my bosses at the corporation decided to rip all that up. Boo! They thought cars and roads were the future. I always knew that was a mistake. In the absence of our beautiful trams, it was buses that stepped in to fill the gaps. Please welcome to the flare, Strathclyde's buses! In the 1960s, all buses within the Glasgow city boundary were owned by our local council, or corporation as it was called back then. Glasgow Corporation Transport provided all the bus services we needed for local journeys round the town. Then nearly all the buses out with the city limits were run by companies owned by the Nationalised Scottish Bus Group, or SBG for short. They were Western, Midland, Central and Eastern. After the Second World War, some smart-arse town planners, Abercrombie and Bruce, decided to completely reshape Glasgow. They uprooted hundreds of communities for the city centre and moved us all out to new schemes on the outskirts. Castlemilk, Pollock, Drumchapel and Easterhouse, and some even further into Lanarkshire with new towns in East Kilbride and Cumbernauld. But all that just meant mere travelling. With tens of thousands of us having to come in and out the town every day, the trouble was our public transport policy hadn't caught up. Buses in Glasgow were still bound by the Monopolies Act passed in 1930. Which meant that no corporate buses were allowed to travel beyond the city limits. And the other bus companies could pick up local passengers if they were travelling in from outside. That might have made sense when Glasgow was a densely populated city, but now we were a sprawling conurbation and we needed a public transport network to match. That meant coordinating and integrating public transport across the whole region to provide a joined up service so everybody could get around easily without needing to own a car. There was talk of the Scottish Bus Group taking over corporate buses as part of a new company called Clydeside Omnibuses, but a new plan was on its way instead. The 1968 Transport Act created the power to set up passenger transport executives for our big metropolitan areas, whose task it would be to provide a properly integrated and efficient system of public passenger transport. I thought it sounded like a great idea. central government was offering big grants to buy new buses, as well as subsidies to run services to the communities that needed them the most. Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham and Newcastle went first, and Glasgow was set to follow. On the 1st of June 1973, the Greater Glasgow Passenger Transport Executive was formed, or GGPTE for short. It inherited 1,300 buses for Glasgow Corporation, as well as the subway. Its designated area was way bigger than the monopoly boundary, but still only a fraction of the size of Strathclyde. But GGPTE's mission was to expand and improve our network, to coordinate and integrate routes, timetables and fares. It launched Transcard tickets, which you could use on PTE buses and the subway. And it began collaborating with British Rail. Together they reopened the underground rail lines that ran through Central and Queen Street lower levels, which had been closed by that beaching. And they modernised the subway, building new interchanges at Partick and Buchanan Street. But it couldn't coordinate and integrate all the buses because it didn't control them. I said at the time that the PTE should have taken over all bus routes within its area, like what happened in Manchester and Birmingham. That would have been all Central's network. Western services in Renfrewshire, Eastern services in Airdrie and Baillieston, and Midlands in Milngavie, Kirkie and Cumbernauld. That would have added another 1,200 buses to the PTE's fleet. But the Scottish bus group were fiercely resistant. They dug in their heels and went for a corporate rebrand instead, becoming Western Scottish, Midland Scottish, Central Scottish, and, Eastern Scottish. But the balance of power began to shift in 1975 when the PTE was taken over by the new Strathclyde Regional Council. The Strathclyde region covered a vast area, which was home to more than 2.5 million people, half of Scotland's population. And our new council had statutory duty to provide a coordinated and efficient system of public transport to meet the needs of everybody across the region. And GGPTE was charged with delivering it. Its designated area increased nearly 10 times to include transport areas in Lanark, Ayr, Dumbarton, Greenock and Loch Gilphead. The PTE had a huge task on its hands. But finally, by the end of the decade, some progress had been made. On the 1st of November 1979, Transclyde was launched. Strathclyde's new interlinking integrated transport system. Brand new trains at brand new stations on the brand new underground. Interchange with trains and buses, ride the brand new cars around. Link up, link up, link up. TransClyde links you Clyde-wide. You could now use your Transcard ticket on all rail, bus and subway in the whole of Strathclyde, even SBG buses. We went into the 1980s with the closest we have ever come to a fully integrated regional public transport network. Things were looking up. GGPTE was finally renamed Strathclyde PTE to belatedly acknowledge its responsibilities to serve the whole of the region. And in 1982, the monopoly boundary was finally abolished after 52 years. This enabled Scottish Bus Group buses to expand into the city. And the PTE's buses were finally able to venture out with the city centre. So much had changed in such a short space of time, another rebrand was definitely in order. In May 1983, TransClyde became Strathclyde Transport. All the PTE's buses were painted Strathclyde Red, which was actually a bright orange colour to match the subway. All the region's trains were painted Strathclyde Red as well, and even some of your ferries. Full integration was within our grasp. But central government had a different idea.
The Conservatives saw people who travelled by bus as failures in life. They were opposed to the public ownership and control of all services and infrastructure. They saw no benefits in coordination and integration, and they saw great dangers in public subsidy. Their vision for public transport wouldn't require any strategic planning anyway. They thought the invisible hand of the market could do that work. Their 1985 Transport Act would deregulate bus operations everywhere in Britain except London, meaning anyone could start a bus company and run routes wherever they thought they could make most money. It was to be a brave new free market experiment, but the Scottish Bus Group were ready for the fight.
In preparation for deregulation, SBG restructured and rebranded again. Western Scottish was split in two to form Western and Clydeside. And Central Scottish was split in two too, as Central and Kelvin. They all had bright new liveries in the hope of attracting new business. The Transport Act demanded that all Britain's municipal bus operators be transferred into arm's-length public companies. So in 1986, Strathclyde Transport became Strathclyde's Buses Limited. Although it was still owned by the regional council, its public subsidy was removed and it was going to have to fight to survive. Then, in August 1986, the infamous Glasgow Bus Wars began. SBG buses piled into the city centre to make the most of lucrative routes. Dirty tactics were rife, with operators blocking bus stops or running just in front of the others to pick up passengers first. Some old private companies like McGill's of Barrhead, founded in 1933, introduced new services. then there were newcomers too, like Stagecoach for Perth, which ran so-called magic buses into the city for the schemes. At one point, there were 280 buses an hour on Renfield Street. The whole city became gridlocked. Kelvin, Central and Clydeside worked in cahoots with Hop-On robot tickets, which you could only use on their services. And Strathclyde's buses fought back by launching the Super Trans card, which wasn't that super as you could only use it on their buses. They also took advantage of deregulation by moving out beyond their traditional boundaries to run services to the towns outside. Bus routes, timetables and tickets were changing so quickly it was almost impossible for anybody to keep up. The result was chaos. Integration had become disintegration. And the SPG companies could no longer take it. In May 1989, Western and Clydeside were merged back together as Western. And in July, Kelvin and Central merged to become Kelvin Central Buses. Now they were nicely fattened up for privatisation. If you thought the 1980s were chaotic, things were about to go from bad to worse. Not only did we have no one planning and coordinating our bus services to work for us, the Conservatives wanted all the remaining public bus companies privatised. That included the state-owned Scottish Bus Group and the regional council's Strathclyde's buses. They claimed this would bring better services and reduce fares by increasing competition. But the opposite was about to prove true. The first for the chop was Kelvin Central Buses, sold to its management on 18th of February 1991. Next up was Western, which was split back into two companies again. Western being sold to its management that October, and Clydeside being sold to its employees to become Clydeside 2000. Then, in February 1993, after 99 years in public ownership, Strathclyde's Buses was sold to its management and employees for £30 million, becoming SB Holdings Limited. Almost immediately, it started a spin-off brand called GCT, the initials of the old Glasgow Corporation Transport, bringing back the old green and yellow colours. Meanwhile, the wee upstarts for Perth, Stagecoach, bought out Western. In a deregulated market, it was grow or die. So in October 1994, Strathclyde's Buses bought out Kelvin Central Buses and gave it a new KCB logo. This gave it the biggest network it had ever had. But further takeovers were brewing. Stagecoach had its heart set on buying the Strathclyde's Buses empire, but the sale was blocked by the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. 2 years later, Aberdeen's First Bus swooped in and bought all Strathclyde's Buses operations for £110 million. First Bus became the biggest bus company in the whole of the UK. Meanwhile, McGill's Bar Head was bought by Clydeside 2000, then owned by the Cowie Group, and both were rebranded Arriva. While all this was unfolding, the Strathclyde PTE were impotent bystanders. All they could do was try and keep up with the comings and goings and attempt to fill in the gaps. So they hatched a plan for a new tram network. The Strathclyde tram would link Easterhouse to Drumchapel, passing through the city centre and the West End. Years of work went into the proposals, which should have been up and running by 2000. But the private bus companies saw the new tram as a threat to their profits. They'd grown so powerful by then that they challenged the proposals at a Westminster Commission in 1995. And the Strathclyde tram was stopped. And the Strathclyde Regional Council was abolished that same year. So we lost all our power to fight back. Westminster had been allowed to meddle with our public transport far too much. But soon, it'd be down to the new Scottish Parliament to decide. By the start of the new millennium, it was clear the big bus businesses ruled the show. First, Stagecoach and Arriva were all new multinational companies listed on the stock exchange with one priority: making profit for their shareholders. They cut all routes which they didn't consider commercially viable, and they hiked up the fares on all those remaining. Huntersure communities were left isolated, locked out of jobs and opportunities, or forced to buy cars they couldn't afford. It was pushing people into poverty, and it was a disaster for our climate. And what was the new Scottish Government's big idea to sort out this mess? Just to give all these private companies more money. Their 2001 Transport Act made it legal to give big grants to bus operators. And instead of re-regulating them to ensure they provided the services we needed in return, they decided to politely try to persuade them by working in partnership instead. An approach that was clearly doomed to fail. There were a few brave newcomers into this foray, like Glasgow City Bus, which ran routes into town for Dumbartonshire, as well as a few mere takeovers for everybody to try and keep up with. Arriva had bigger fish to fry, so it sold its West Scotland operations to some local businessmen who decided to bring back the old McGill's brand to cash in on its trusted reputation. They went on to become Scotland's third biggest bus company after taking over Explore Dundee. And Glasgow City Bus was bought out by the old West Coast Motors, which was quietly building up its own bus empire. Deregulation had left us with a public transport system that was fragmented and expensive. What we desperately needed was a re-empowered regional transport authority to sort it out. Unfortunately, the Scottish Government had other ideas. Their aim was to centralise power in Holyrood. So they created a new government body, Transport Scotland, which cared much more about building roads than regulating buses. And they stripped yet more powers away for Strathclyde. In 2006, our old PTE was renamed Strathclyde Partnership for Transport. It lost control of our region's railways and became a mere husk of its former self. It was no surprise then that over the next decade, bus fares continued to rise and millions more miles of routes were cut. By 2019, passenger numbers had halved since deregulation. We were given more than £320 million in public subsidy to private bus companies every year. And we still didn't have a simple, affordable ticket for use on all buses, trains and subway. Oh, unless you were a visiting dignitary, of course, then all the stops were pulled out for you. 20 years of Scottish transport policy had just continued the race to the bottom. But finally, it looks like some positive change is on its way. The new Scottish Transport Act offers regional transport authorities the power to re-regulate buses for the first time since 1986. And the power to set up a new publicly owned bus company for our region, which can run services to meet our needs. The question now is whether these powers will be put to good use. My dream has always been for a public transport network that is just so good that no matter where you live in our region, you can get around easily and affordably without needing to own a car. A network that ensures that all our communities are connected with a world-class service that they deserve. We need to pick up where TransClyde left off in the 1980s. But we need to make sure we do it right this time. That means creating a new regional transport authority for the Glasgow City region, which will always act in our interests. Then we can finally re-regulate all the private bus companies in our region, so we can plan and coordinate the bus network to feed into and complement the trains and the subway so that the system works together as a whole. And we can have one simple ticket for use across all transport modes that automatically caps your spend, something London's had since 2003. We can't afford to waste any more time. We need our politicians to listen to us, as we're the ones who know what we need. Let's get everybody using public transport to tackle the climate emergency. And let's create thousands of green jobs running our world-class service. Ugh, we could even bring back the Clippies.
Thank you for watching Bus Regulation the Musical, created by me, Ellie Harrison, in collaboration with the Get Glasgow Moving public transport campaign, featuring music by Andrew Lloyd Webber and starring Katie Thompson as the Clippy, with skaters from Glasgow Roller Derby, Nicole Meehan, Sarah McGettigan, Heather McDougall, Heather Roberts, Molly Ezell and Lauren Crone, and from Main City Roller Derby, Ruby East and Ruth Brandon, and the Sugar and Spin skate crew, Chrissy Ardle and Libby O'Dye. Our stagehands were Emily Furno, Ellie Harrison, Susan Galloway and Radine Moncrief. It was produced by Emily Furno and supported by Creative Scotland, Platform, Glasgow Centre for Population Health, the University of Glasgow and Civis. If you do one thing when you leave this evening, please join Get Glasgow Moving and let's fight for the world-class public transport system we deserve.